And Michael was also the kind of mover and shaker behind the HOPE project that explores experiences and behaviors in Denmark during the COVID-19 crisis. There is also an international arm to the HOPE project, and I think this is what we will hear a little bit about today. But Michael, please take us away.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Let me share my screen. Yeah. There we are. So what I'll be talking about today is work in the HOPE project on vaccine skepticism and how vaccine skepticism can be changed, how it can be decreased. And I think we are all aware of the importance of vaccinations in the overall strategy, but just to sort of get us started, then this is a sort of illustration of the current situation that we are in and the role played with by the vaccines. So this is an illustration that I've been working on together with, among others, Andreas Röpstorff. And what you can sort of see here is that the current situation is that we are being hit by these new variants. And as a consequence of that, which are way more infectious, then stronger measures have been needed. They have been needed both here in Denmark and elsewhere in order to avoid this very steep red curve. So the hope is that by introducing stronger measures, we can sort of get the epidemic curve below the healthcare system capacity. The good news, however, is that we don't need to be under these very strong measures forever, because vaccines will come basically and save us. And this is a very different situation than in the spring, where you remember the red and the green curve, most likely, but where the situation was basically about stretching out the epidemic curve, that all of us should get infected sometime, but rather later than sooner. This time we're sort of saved in the end by the vaccines. So vaccinations are basically what should be keeping all our hopes up during these difficult times. Of course, the thing is that vaccinations, or the availability of vaccines, are not a solution in and of themselves. A key condition for this sort of end game is that there is in fact high degrees of vaccination willingness in the general publics around the world. And what you can see here is data until November last year about the willingness to receive an approved COVID vaccine in 8 Western democracies: Denmark, Sweden, United Kingdom, United States, Italy, France, Germany, and Hungary. What you can see here are histograms where they answered on a 5-point scale to which degree they agreed with the statement that they wanted to receive an approved vaccine. And we can see that in some countries there are very high vaccination willingness. Denmark, we see most people are willing to get vaccinated. But in other countries, we see much lower vaccination willingness, in particular Italy, and even more so in France and Hungary. People are skeptical about receiving vaccines. It should be mentioned that, as I said, these data are from November. We have since been collecting more data, and the most recent data from January suggests that vaccine willingness has increased in most countries, but not in all. In fact, it seems that the French, despite the fact that they're living under extremely severe restrictions and have been doing so for a long time, seem to be as skeptical as ever. For most countries, however, this increase in willingness to get vaccinated suggests that things are pretty good. But there is one looming issue on the horizon. And that is the availability of not just one vaccine or two vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna, but the availability of a range of different vaccines that differ in the particular characteristics that they have, in particular their degree of efficiency. So what you can see here is a headline from the Danish national broadcast station saying, well, there are new vaccines on the way to Denmark, referring to AstraZeneca. It's way less effective, so why should we even have it? And we have been doing some data collection in collaboration with the Danish Health Authority, where we have been providing people with different vaccines or descriptions of different vaccines that vary on a number of different dimensions. And from these data, it seems that that there is a tendency for at least the Danish public to think that why should we in fact have this less efficient vaccine? What you can see on the sort of large and busy figure is the causal effect of on vaccination willingness from a number of different types of feature. And I just want you to focus on the vaccine features that are at the top of the graph, which is vaccine efficiency. And it turns out that this is in fact one of the most important factors for Danes and the vaccination willingness. So if we move from a vaccine that is 50% effective to a vaccine that is 90% effective, then the vaccination willingness basically changes with 25%. So it suggests that when less effective vaccines are being rolled out, we might still face the problem of an unwilling public, even here in Denmark. So a big question is how to decrease vaccine skepticism. And one of the key arguments that have been circulating both in the industry, among researchers and among authorities is the notion of radical transparency. So this is the headline of an editorial in Nature, arguing that in order to have confidence in COVID vaccines, we need radical transparency. So basically that authorities and the industry is as transparent as possible about the features of the vaccines, how they have been tested, and so on. And the sort of argument that radical transparency is required is related to this concept of the infodemic. So you can see here on the left, the World Health Organization and a number of other international organizations have been arguing that we are suffering from an infodemic, that we have, next to the sort of spread of the virus itself, we have the spread of misinformation, and that is something that will cause significant harm to our health, including in the domain of vaccinations. And the basic idea from social psychology is that one of the reasons why transparency might help counter this infodemic is that conspiracy theories and acceptance of misinformation is driven by uncertainty. So people who are more uncertain will be more likely to believe in conspiracy theories, and people who have personality traits where they have more difficult time dealing with uncertainty are more susceptible to conspiracy theories and misinformation. So the idea is to counter the infodemic by radical transparency. So the research question that we have been wrestling with is, well, is this true? Can we in fact increase vaccination willingness via transparency? One could say that independently of what the answer to this question is, then it's normatively desirable to have transparency just out of democratic principles. But at the same time, it is important to understand what is it in fact that transparency does to vaccination willingness. Also because there is a potential danger, namely that everything is good in sort of as long as the transparency reveals a very efficient and safe vaccine. But is there potential backfire effects from transparency if we are transparently describing a very ineffective and not so safe vaccine? At least the effects from this experiment suggest that it can decrease vaccination willingness substantially if there are more like negative features of the vaccine. So in order to evaluate these different scenarios, we conducted an experiment. So this experiment was collected between October 14 and October 21 last year. So this was collected prior to the release of any information about vaccines against COVID. So no one knew what actually to expect. So we sampled a lot of people, 3,000, almost 7,000 respondents, half Americans, half Danes. And we conducted this experiment via online surveys collected by YouGov on samples that were reflective of the national populations. So in this survey, the respondents were presented with experimentally manipulated communication about a new vaccine against the coronavirus, which we call COVAXIT. This experiment, it was pre-registered on OSF, and it received fast track approval from the Aarhus University Research Ethics Committee. So we did a number of things in this experiment, and I will sort of take it step by step. First, what we did was that we provided people with a description of a vaccine. That was sort of the first experimental factor. And the idea, the guiding idea was to use features of flu vaccines as a baseline description in order to facilitate both transparency and vagueness or lack of transparency. So respondents were randomly assigned to one of three descriptions: either transparent communication about a vaccine that is worse, so to speak, than a flu vaccine, or transparent, so that's sort of transparent negative information. Then another group of people were exposed to transparent but positive information about COVAXIT, saying, well, this is as good as a flu vaccine, which is one of the most used vaccines. And then finally, one group of participants were exposed to what we call a vague description of the vaccine, which is basically that the authority says this is good enough, don't worry, everything is fine, sort of. And after they were exposed to this information, we received, or we asked their support of this vaccine through 12 different items that we measured agreement and disagreement with. And these items sort of move into or focus on a range of different aspects, both whether they support the approval of the vaccine, whether they would encourage others to get vaccinated with the vaccine, whether they would be vaccinated themselves, whether they would feel safe when getting the vaccine, whether they felt that they need more information, and whether they sort of bought into conspiracy theories about the authorities withholding important information. So we have pre-registered all sorts of complicated hypotheses about how there might be effects on some, but not all of these factors. But in the end, the data shows that it's just sort of one big latent trait of vaccine support. So I'll just be showing you the results for the overall measure of vaccine support, which we rescale to vary between 0 and 1, with 1 being higher degree of support. All right, what we find is this, that transparency is basically necessary but not sufficient for vaccine support. So overall, we find pretty small effects of these different types of communication. But what we find is that people are most positive towards the transparent positive vaccine, both in Denmark and United States. But unfortunately, seen from the transparency perspective, they are least supportive of the transparent negative vaccine. So the vaguely described vaccine is somewhere in the middle, but also closer to the negatively described one. So this suggests that it's not enough just to be transparent. What really matters is the features of the vaccine. However, the sort of radical transparency argument goes a bit further than this. And the argument is really that transparency, that the main effect of transparency is to buffer against misinformation. And in order to test that more directly, we included a second experimental factor in the experiment. So what you just saw were the results from this control condition, but at the same time, we also randomly assigned people to 2 other conditions. And I'll focus on what we call the conspiracy induction now. So basically, after reading the description, people were exposed to a sort of description of conspiracy-like rhetoric, saying that they are hiding the information, and they are really just sort of disregarding ordinary Americans' health and safety, and are just trying to do whatever they can to get us to take the vaccine. And the question is, if you have seen a transparent description, are you then less likely to be moved by this misinformation induction, so to speak? So the short answer is no. Here you have the results. What you can see is both the control condition, the effect in the control condition, and the effects in the conspiracy induction. And basically, they are completely similar, and there are no interactions between the transparency inductions or the transparent descriptions and the conspiracy inductions. Also, it turns out that the conspiracy induction doesn't really do much on its own. It's not that it really decreases or the opposite vaccine support much. But it seems that transparency doesn't increase vaccine support, but it also doesn't have this extra effect of helping buffer misinformation. We also tested a third question. So as you saw, people reacted negatively to the transparent negative information. And the question is there something we can do to buffer against that potential effect? And in order to test that, we also had a third experimental condition in this in the second experimental factor, which we called the certainty induction. So the point was that there are uncertainties related to the approval of corona vaccines, but there has in fact been done a lot to increase certainty. In particular, they have been tested on substantially larger samples than ordinary vaccines, including the ordinary flu vaccine. So if we're sort of getting this information saying, well, yes, this vaccine might not be as good as the vaccine against the flu, but we have taken your concern seriously, and we have done what we can given the short amount by increasing the sample size a lot. Does that change anything? And what we can, so here you see the oh, this is not very helpful because you cannot see what the different factors are. But overall, what we can see is that the certainty induction has an effect such that people become more positive towards vaccines when they get this certainty induction, but it doesn't, again, interact with the communication about the vaccines. So it simply has a general main effect. It doesn't sort of alleviate the relative negative effect of receiving the negative transparent information. So we cannot sort of offer against the negative effects of negative transparent information in this way. So the overall issue is that there are relative small effects of communication, that the communication doesn't really change opinions that much. We see in the experiment there's around 9% difference between the sort of the negative transparent condition and the positive transparent condition. So that's not large effects. And the reason is that vaccine skepticism, at least in October, were mainly driven by individual difference variables rather than these contextual factors. So what you can see here is, again, a relatively busy plot, but basically it shows the correlations in Denmark and United States between a number of demographics and a number of psychological variables. I will focus on the top three variables. So first of all, as you might recall, this argument about transparency was based on the notion that vaccine skepticism is driven by feelings of uncertainty. The sort of classical individual difference measure about abilities to handle uncertainty is the measure of need for cognitive closure. But what we can see is that need for cognitive closure doesn't actually correlate with vaccine skepticism in either United States or Denmark. What does predict vaccine skepticism is, or vaccine support, is political cynicism and the feeling that the COVID pandemic constitutes a symbolic threat. So political cynicism is a measure of the extent to which you have distrust in the political system, and the symbolic threat measure is a measure of the extent to which you feel that, for example, in the United States, whether the pandemic threatens American culture, American democracy, the American way of life. So what we can see is that it's basically the concerns about what does this do to democracy and the feeling that democracy is already something to be distrustful of that drives vaccine skepticism. And this is more important than many other factors, including the feeling that that the pandemic constitutes a real personal threat for you, for your health, and so on, which is kind of surprising. But this also suggests that when communication doesn't really matter that much, it is because vaccine skepticism is fundamentally driven by mistrust in the messenger. So if you have a low degree of trust in the messenger, then it doesn't really matter that much what the message is from that source. So what we're finding is that transparency is necessary but not sufficient. Only if transparency communication reveals an effective and safe vaccine does transparent communication about it actually increase vaccine support. This doesn't suggest that vague positivity, so to speak, is a communication strategy that should be used, because as you saw, then the vaguely positive communication is almost as bad as for vaccine support as the sort of transparent communication about negative features. So in that sense, we can potentially interpret the effect of vague positivity as that it seems to be seen as a cover for negative features. And the reason why transparency as a general remedy fails is because uncertainty is not really the driver of vaccine skepticism. Rather, as I was describing, vaccine skepticism is driven by this deep skepticism about the political system and its handling of COVID-19. And that means that it is difficult to reach skeptics because they don't actually trust the messenger. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means that we should all say hooray for mRNA because it is, things would have been much worse if the first vaccines that were rolled out had worse features than they actually have. As far as I know, then the initial expectations from the World Health Organization was that they were happy if we got a vaccine that was 50% effective over a 6 months period after 2 doses. And I think that the situation would have been much worse in terms of vaccination willingness if that scenario actually came through, compared to these insanely effective vaccines. So beyond that, we should just say hooray for mRNA. Then what are the next steps? Well, one thing that we want to look at is that might there be other effects of transparency? So while transparency might not sort of in itself increase vaccine uptake, then it might be pretty crucial from a long-term communication perspective that people are better able to uphold trust in health authorities that communicate in a transparent ways. So what we will be testing next is whether transparency increased trust in the center. But if you have other ideas, then that we should look into, then I am all ears, because we will be fielding the next series of studies in the coming weeks in order to revise the manuscript for publication. But I also think that there are reasons to ask, well, what are the next steps in the pandemic, or what to expect over the coming months with regards to rolling out the vaccines here in the pandemic? And I think, well, first of all, I think that in most countries, the primary problem is probably not vaccination willingness, but is more the actual availability of vaccines. But beyond that, if we're looking at what could the potential challenges for vaccination willingness be, well, first of all, I expect that we will see increasing political disagreement over the coming months. In other parts of the HOPE project, we have seen that there is a general decreasing trend across all countries in support of the government's handling of COVID over time. And that doesn't seem to reflect how badly the countries are doing in terms of infection numbers. It doesn't seem to reflect how stringent the responses are. It simply appears as with the passing of time, people become fed up with what is going on as they experience the costs more and more saliently. We also know from both these results and other results from the HOPE project and other research as well, that lack of agreement with the government and the authorities is something that can drive down vaccination willingness. So I'm thinking that we may see some decrease in vaccination willingness over the coming months, at least in some countries where they have lower levels of trust in the authorities than here in Denmark. And also, I think that this may be facilitated by the debates about new vaccines. So I think that the mRNA vaccines, absent any sort of events with side effects, that they are pretty safe from being targets of misinformation and skepticism. But I think the new vaccines that will be coming out, which might have lower efficiency, they could potentially be strong targets of misinformation and skepticism. At least I think that is a fear that authorities need to take seriously and figure out how to deal with. And with that, I want to say thank you to the Carlsberg Foundation, who has funded the HOPE project, to a lot of people in the HOPE team, well, the entire HOPE team, but especially the people who have been helping with the research I've been presenting today, which is Andreas Røbstorff, Sune Lehmann, Rebecca Adler-Nissen, Frederik Jørgensen, Alexander Bohr, and Marie Fly. The basic or the sort of central experiment is available on SciArchive as a preprint. So there you can go and check out all the details. And with that, I want to say thank you for listening.
Thanks, Mikael. Great, really thought-provoking. Please raise your hands, ideally on the screen, if you want to ask a question. And it's also nice if you are in a space where you can turn on your camera so that we can see there are actually people out there. Brandy, you had the first question, and then Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. As always, super interesting work, Mikael. You know, I share your fascination with the biased assimilation of information and identity protective cognition. And I actually have a lot of ideas on this. So I'll send you an email because I'm working, as a matter of fact, myself on a paper called The Messenger is the Message, looking at these same effects in relation to climate change and some experiments that I've done, that I think could have important implications for this issue as well. So sorry, I can't turn my camera on. I have several people streaming and it will just shut down completely.
Thank you very much, Brandy. I look forward to reading what you sent, and I sympathize with the problem of homeschooling and how that is a drain on the internet connection.
Yeah, I think just kind of fundamentally, I'm going to say really quickly to sort of summarize my comment, though, for the others, is that, you know, this idea that giving people more information is solution is in most cases, as we know, ineffective. In some cases, depending on the reason for skepticism. But I do have other ideas, as I mentioned, and I kind of always mention this, not because I really want to draw attention to it, but because my prior background was in the private sector as a communications strategist, where we were testing strategies literally across hundreds of thousands and sometimes even millions of people. So we would actually see these for large NGOs. So these, I kind of knew what worked, but I didn't always know why. And so that's the thing that I think I've gained being trained as a scientist, digging down into the why behind what works. So, so I'd like to tell you some of these things, and maybe we can, take the conversation in another time.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Neve, did you have a question?
A couple of questions, in fact. So the first one regards to your choosing the flu vaccine as like a base rate. And yes, I don't know how things are in Denmark, and definitely not in the United States, but where I come from, the influenza vaccine is a bit of a laughing stock in the general public. So vaccination rates in general, you know, for your normal vaccines like mumps and rubella and all that are very high. But the flu vaccine, you know, you obviously, generally you take it if you are in a risk group, and if you're not, then not really usually. And as the positive framing that you used, if memory serves, is that the new vaccine is as good as the flu vaccine. I wonder if this has actually been perceived as really positive, as a positive thing. And maybe what you actually did was comparing something that is, you know, bad, so not as good as the flu vaccine, it's definitely very bad if it's not even as good as that, to something that is just neutral or even. Yeah, so I was wondering, how would you, what do you think the results might have been if you had used a more efficacious vaccine as another spot? And the second question that I had was with regard to uncertainty, which you pointed out does not really correlate the need for certainty with willingness to vaccinate. I have a bit of data from Facebook groups, again, not Danish and not American, but I don't think this data is particularly extraordinary in this regard. And people discussing the vaccine, both in Vaccine Skeptic and in pro-vaccine groups, they do use certainty and uncertainty. This is one of the major themes in discussion. How can we know that these vaccines are actually safe? How can we know that they're really, et cetera, et cetera. And they don't always frame it in, you know, using the messenger, as you say. How can we know this vaccine is safe? Because we cannot trust the pharmaceutical companies. Obviously, sometimes they say this, but I would say more often they don't bother even saying that. They would say things like, how can we know this is safe? It hasn't been tested enough. They couldn't have tested it enough. There hasn't been enough time. We don't know the long range side effect and so on. So how would you say that the fact that this is one of the major themes, how can it be put in accordance with your data that it doesn't really correlate? So these are my two questions.
Thank you very much. These are very good questions. So with regards to whether the flu vaccine is sufficiently good as or whether it portrays a vaccine as good to be as good as the flu vaccine, I think it's certainly something to look into. And I think when we conduct the next study, then we will have one condition where we do exactly what you suggest, have one that is better than the flu vaccine, also because that the world has changed since October. Like now people want a 95% efficiency, or they cannot bother with getting vaccinated. So I think that is a possibility. in October, I think I was, or we were influenced by this WHO estimate that the vaccines would be pretty terrible, and therefore we simply chose this as a good realistic baseline, also a baseline that people would have some trust in, because it is regularly used. It's one of the most used vaccines. So that was the idea for choosing it. But I completely agree, especially now that the flu vaccine, being as good as the flu vaccine, is not good enough. So we will include that other condition. About the uncertainty, that is really an interesting observation. So if I should engage in some post hoc rationalization, then my argument would be that sort of also what you said, that what is driving the uncertainty is mistrust in the authorities, and rather than some deep fundamental psychological uncertainty, and that the raising of uncertainty is mainly used as a rhetorical strategy to not necessarily consciously, but as a rhetorical or a motivated reasoning type of process, where you try to cast negative light on the vaccine, but that the underlying driver is the mistrust. So that would be my sort of way of post hoc rationalizing what you are saying. But I think it is important, and it is crucial to bridge the divides that can be between these sort of relatively simple quantitative analysis and observations in the wild.
Okay, we have a question coming in also from. I'm sorry, she is on a bad internet connection, so it's. Sorry. So Noah asks, how would the argument about the trust in the center work out in relation to vaccination willingness in the Israeli case? Here, about a third of the population has been vaccinated, but trust in the center is, I believe, although I do not have the data, low, certainly lower than it is in the Danish case. Would it make sense, for instance, in Israel, to think of generational or age group differences, or something like racial and sexual identity differences, and their histories of dealing with specific diseases? So in a sense, we seem to have a much more complex situation in terms of, both trust in the government and the perceived kind of cultural histories, but also cultural histories of dealing with diseases. And can your data throw any light on a situation as complex as that?
I think the short answer is no, but that shouldn't prevent me from speculating a bit on the Israeli case. So one of the interesting things that we are seeing in the experimental data that I briefly showed you, where I was focusing on the effect of efficiency, like one of the things that we're seeing in the Danish case is that people are more motivated to be vaccinated if more other people have been vaccinated. So there's like this rolling snowball effect that when some people have been vaccinated and you sort of see, well, okay, they didn't die of it, then that in itself generates a motivation to become vaccinated. So I think that is also those people who do not have sort of deep mistrust of authorities, but might have some concerns about, well, the how much has this been tested, given the short-term horizon and so on. They can sort of get some security and reduce their anxiety by the fact that a lot of other people have been vaccinated. So I think when the ball first starts rolling, then that can help. One of the things that we also have seen as crucially important, there's a preprint led by Jay Van Bowel from New York University, where the HOPE project has contributed with some Danish data in collaboration with other people from Aarhus University, and there we collected data in the entire team from, I think, 40 something different countries in the spring to see what is a good predictor of support for the national strategy and what is of sort of engaging in physical distancing and so forth. And what we saw there was that national identification was a large predictor. And the specific Israeli case and the history of Israel could mean that there is this high level of national identification, which helps sort of create this notion of we are doing this as a collective, and this is a collective project, and we are all sort of putting in our doing our part, so to speak. So I think that might help as well, despite the fact that there might be something that might be lower trust in authorities in Israel.
Thanks. There is a really interesting follow-up also from Winifred in the chat, where she talks about the Chinese situation. And there you can see that people who have a high trust in the government would also tend to trust the Chinese vaccines. Whereas if you have a low trust in the government, you might be looking elsewhere. Just so to say, confirming the basic idea that there are very strong interrelations between some much more global phenomenon and something as local as, do you want to take a vaccine or a specific vaccine or not? So that's certainly something to look more into.
Yeah, and I want to make a little bit of comment on that, because in China it's kind of diverse into two groups, and one of the group you can call like a patriotics, and they will believe in the government and also the vaccine developed by China in a way. And the other group, they're like me, living outside of China, or they have a more international backgrounds. So they know there are many other kinds of vaccine in the country, and it's quite different from China, because in China, you don't have any choice on the vaccine you will take. But they know from the other countries, for example, in Denmark, we have quite a lot of vaccines developed by different institutions and also the pharmacy company. So they kind of compare the situation in China and with the other countries for the, like, you can say the more international groups, and they're not very in doubt about the efficiency, and they're holding a opinion that because like the coronavirus is a kind of emergent situation, and you can't really see like when will the second or third break is gonna be happen. So they're saying, well, if we have the access to the vaccine, then it's fine. We don't really care about, is it like 50 or 75 or 90? And it's just the problem of access. But they're very worried about the safety problem, because like, as we talked about before about the transparency, because we don't have any access to the knowledge about the safety experiment readouts from the government or any other information resources. So people are kind of worried about the safety. Yeah, but for the willingness, they will see if they have the chance to get other vaccines. For example, when you're resident in Denmark, you maybe have a chance to get the vaccine in Denmark or Australia and America. But for people who have, it's kind of dilemma for them, because they don't trust the government 100% and they don't trust the safety of the vaccine 100%, but they don't have other choices. So that's kind of a specific and niche situation in China.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So just one sort of question, is your sense that that will have the effect of decreasing trust in the government?
I think this result is kind of the same with your experiment, because people already they don't trust the government so much, and the willingness of vaccine, it doesn't have to be related necessarily with trustworthiness on the government. They will be like, okay, maybe we will take the vaccine at some time point for better activity access to the other part of the world. But the level of the trust on the government, they won't be influenced by the vaccine or the coronavirus situation. You can understand it's more like a process. It's because you can call it like trust crisis happen on the government. It has accumulated for a very long time. So it doesn't relate to the coronavirus situation happened from 2019.
Yeah. Rebecca, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, just a quick one. Great, really interesting talk, Michael, of course. I was really interested in seeing the association between gender and a real discrepancy in your US and Danish data. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that. I know it's not really a focus, but what is your impression?
It's a very good question, and I was surprised by the effect in United States in particularly, because there has been other research showing that females across countries are significantly more likely to comply with COVID restrictions, and that effect seems to be super robust. And for vaccination willingness or vaccine support, we're sort of finding the same in Denmark, but not in the United States, where there's a large negative effect. And I have no idea basically what is going on. Yes, perhaps an American female could tell me what is going on.
I mean, my suspicion would be perhaps the history of, there's a bit of a longer history of robust vaccine skepticism in the US, and it's largely been focused before on childhood vaccination. And the prime movers in that movement have mostly been, concerned mothers. At least those are the popular figureheads. There's also, there's quite a big influencer movement around anti-vaccination that has also kind of gotten entangled with other conspiracy movements, which we know are pretty widespread in the US. And what's interesting is both the anti-vaccine movement and really fringe movements like QAnon have actually taken over sort of traditionally lefty spaces, like the wellness influencer community, or yoga moms not vaccinating their kids. That's really become a prominent, a prominent part of social media in the US. And I know we have some of this. I mean, some of our colleagues in Hope have looked at some of these subculture communities and that sort of organize around alternative views or alternative lifestyles. That certainly is present in Denmark, but I'm not sure that it has had the range. So I think it's a combination of sort of historical, the history of anti-vaccine movements in the US, and then also the sort of conspiracy theory landscape of the US and women's role in those two movements. That would be my guess, but I was just curious if you had other ideas.
No, but it is super interesting because it's a very large factor in the US data. So we have other data on vaccination willingness from United States, and right now I cannot remember what the effect of gender is there, but I will go back and look to see whether this is a systematic pattern that we are seeing.
Cool.
Brandy, do you have a follow-up on this comment?
Yes, actually I do. I would highly recommend looking at a paper by Kahan and Slovik, Brahman et al. Called Identity, Protective Cognition and the White Male Effect in Risk Perception. Super interesting. relating, and this would be my suspicion based on some of what Rebecca just said, but also my own experience as an American and living in that society for many years, that I think there's something going on in the cognitive algorithm that women are using in terms of how they evaluate risks of, for example, contracting an illness, and in terms of like betting on, let's say, their bodies or the health of their children, their immune systems, versus the risks of the unknowns of an untested or a relatively new vaccine. Why could that be particularly interesting in American society? Well, look at the, I'm trying to think of how to say this succinctly, but the structural issues at play in the US in terms of how women disproportionately bear responsibility, not only for making these decisions, as Rebecca said, also for being primary caregivers of children, and bearing the possible regret in terms of, like, here I'm thinking a little bit about the difference between a consequentialist perspective on risk perception, just the anticipated regret that could come from making a decision that is potentially dangerous. So anyways, if you look into that, I think that this could explain a lot, that women in the US have a very different way of calculating risk than men, given the structural inequalities.
Interesting.
As caregivers primarily.
I'll definitely look at the paper. That makes a lot of sense, both what you're saying, Brandy, and what Rebecca is saying.
Just a follow-up on this from Noah as well, coming in from the chat. So she says it might be worth to look also at the Swedish case and the Finnish case, because apparently in 2009 and 10, following from the vaccine against the flu, the swine flu or the SARS, there was an outbreak of narcolepsy amongst those people who were infected, particularly in those two countries. And there is some rumors that you see kind of a carryover effect now also in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine, that there is simply, you can say, a well-founded mistrust in vaccines due to the outcome of that particular vaccine. So just another kind of international case that might be worth looking for. And particularly in Sweden, I think, Mikael, this is something we should clearly follow in the HOPE project, where we actually have data to look at that. So I don't know if you will comment on that.
Yeah, just one short comment, and that is that is really interesting and can explain the fact that we're seeing pretty low vaccination willingness in Sweden compared to what I would have expected. Yeah. Because Sweden is a high trust culture, so that might explain it.
Yeah, and Noah just shared an article about it in the chat, or I forwarded it. So it's a great case. Mark?
Yes, thanks, Michael. So I guess in a way it's reassuring that people, like if you are very clear that you have a not so good vaccine, that people are inclined not to take it. I mean, that makes sense and is reassuring. But do you know if any work has been done on, because of course it's not only an individual effect when you have a vaccine that has a 50% efficiency, it has an effect on society. Do you know, or have you done any work, maybe I missed it because I had to homeschool a little bit during your talk. Do you know if there is any work done on, would you take this vaccine given that it would have this effect on your society? Or if, if so and so many people took this supposedly shitty vaccine, it would still, confer this effect on your community?
No, I don't think that there is this type of research, but there should be, because if we look at some of the data that we have in our hands and are looking at currently, show that basically what drives Danes' vaccination willingness is that they see it as a duty. It's not because they are personally worried about getting COVID. It is the societal perspective that really drives it, and I see, in a way, I've been sort of a bit baffled about the big effect of efficiency. Like if you do it as a duty, then why care about efficiency? Why not just care about the side effects? And if it doesn't have severe side effects, then just take it independently of what it has of efficiency. But it could be that because people do this for others, they want it to really count. And if it's only 50% efficient, then it doesn't feel as something that counts. But if you shift the rhetoric from focusing on your likelihood of getting affected to the question about how it stops infections in general, like how it helps break infection chains, then I think that might actually be a helpful communication move. So I don't think that has been done, but it's a very good idea.
And I can maybe follow up on this. So we have a small report coming out on the HOPE project homepage either today or tomorrow, where some of the ethnographers have been interviewing people about why do they want to get vaccinated. And it turns out that even among the young population, we see a mixture of, for my own sake arguments, but also very strong societal arguments that it's really not for myself, but it's something I do for the others. So I think these two aspects of the societal and individual perspectives are probably deeply intertwined in the whole vaccine discourse and could be very interesting to tease further apart. So I think it will be coming up as basically a kind of a qualitative analysis later today or tomorrow. And Michael, I was wondering, because something that was really striking in the vaccine data in Denmark from December till January was a massive move towards people now wanting to be vaccinated. And the largest shift was in the group that, so to say, went from being almost certain that they wanted to be vaccinated to those who were absolutely certain. There was more than a 50% increase in that particular group. And I guess what could be really interesting to look at, if you haven't done it already, would be to actually look across some of these different countries and see whether the generalized trust in the government, to the degree that we have an idea of that, is somehow predictive of how large that shift would be, right? Because you could say all of the European and US community would now have more or less access to the same data about the efficacy of the vaccine. And it would, so to say, tell us how much does this translate into actual shifts in attitude. I think that would be a fairly easy thing to look at.
So I haven't been looking at that, but it's a very good point.
Any other questions or comments? If not, let's not shoot the messenger, but applaud the messenger. Michael, thanks for opening our minds and eyes again for the strange things happening during the COVID crisis.
Thank you.